At 9:30 a.m., my doorbell rang incessantly. Because I had just returned from vacation and was still sleeping, I didn't really want to answer the door in my PJs. When I heard what sounded like stones hitting my window, at first I thought one of my friends really wanted to get my attention. When I looked out my window, though, to see who was in my driveway, I saw a gray car parked there, which I did not recognize. I opened my bedroom door, went into the hall, and screamed at the top of my lungs. I saw a very dark-skinned man in my den, stealing my computer. What I thought had been stones were actually him kicking in my back door. But when I screamed, he screamed as well. I scared the bejeebies out of him, thinking he was alone in the house. He jumped out of my den and held his arms out to prevent me from running past him. We were face to face, with only 8 feet between us. He yelled at me, "I'm going to kill you." My front door was right next to him, and my back door was just beyond him, so I had no way of escape. For one brief moment he hesitated, turning back to get the laptop. I raced past him to my back door and made it into my garage. He chased after me closely. I held the door closed and felt him on the other side trying to force it open. We were in a tug of war. Suddenly I felt the pressure release. I opened the door a crack and grabbed my car keys. In the time it took me to open the garage door, he had run back to the den, grabbed my laptop, unlocked my front door, my screen door, and ran to his car and taken off. Well, I raced out the driveway and saw him going down the road. He went left. I went right. I raced through town at 55 miles per hour in a 35 zone to the police station, only 8 minutes away, hoping the police would stop me. When I arrived at the police station, my heart sank. It was closed. The post office was on the corner. In my shorty pajamas, I ran in barefoot and told Arlie to call the police. Sheriffs were sent to my house, while the local policeman arrived at the post office, where he stood with me for 2 hours. People came and went from the post office, wondering why I was standing next to a policeman with my raccoon eyes from smudged mascara and disheveled hair. Finally, the policeman received the message that the coast was clear to return to my house. Around noon, we arrived back at my home, where I, in my shorty pajamas, along with 3 sheriffs and 1 policeman, showed me a paper lineup to identify the suspect. They had scoured my house looking for fingerprints and footprints. None were found. Based on my description of the man in his car, though, he was easy to identify since he had these huge eyes and black curly hair. Turned out he was a professional thief. The sheriffs knew where his girlfriend lived, went to her neighborhood, but the neighbors tipped him off so he escaped. By then, he had already fenced my laptop, which was never recovered. At 3 p.m., though, he went to pick up his girlfriend from work since he had used his car for his dirty work. The sheriffs were there waiting for him. Gloves were in the back seat of the car. Within 5 hours of the break-in, he was apprehended. The thief was in his 50s and had been to prison twice already, even having broken out once. The police drove him to 20 different houses with unsolved cases of break-ins. He admitted to all of them in order to get a reduced sentence of 8 years. It was an extremely harrowing experience. His mistake was assuming that when no one answered the door, no one was in the house. My mistake was in screaming. If I had just kept my mouth shut, he would have stolen both my computers and I could have gotten 2 new ones instead of just 1. This was many years ago, and I was working as a staff nurse in a coronary care unit in England. On this particular night shift, there was myself and 1 other staff nurse on duty. The ward was quite small, and had an 8-bedded ladies' room, an 8-bedded men's room, and 3 individual side rooms. As an agency nurse, it was my first shift in a while on this unit. Well, we had to report, and we were told by the leaving day staff the status and health of all the patients over the day. So in the first room, the day nurse said, was a male patient, aged about 65-ish, who was due to go home in the morning. This patient stood out in my mind because the nurse handing over said he had been in intensive care for a good few weeks following a cardiac arrest incident. His heart had actually stopped for a good 20 minutes, but the team had managed to resuscitate him and he was now down on our ward and ready to go home. Anyway, the day nurse went through the rest of the patients and it looked like we were in for a quiet night of coffee drinking and even a bit of knitting. This was, as I said, many years ago, and drinking hot drinks and knitting was allowed in quiet periods, when there did actually used to be some quiet periods. Anyway, I digress. The day staff left and myself, and let's call the other nurse Jane, began doing our rounds. I started the 10 o'clock OBS. That is, going around to each patient and checking the pulse, blood pressure, and temperature, where necessary. Jane was the nurse in charge, so she began the drug rounds. I popped into the side room 1 and immediately felt uneasy. There was nothing I could put my finger on, just an elderly man sitting in his chair in his pajamas and slippers. There was just something about his eyes, or behind the eyes I guess, that unnerved me a little. Anyway, I had a chat with him and asked if everything was okay, and if he needed anything else for the night. He said he felt very constipated and had had some medicine before we came on duty, and would like to try on the commode. I brought the commode, a toilet on wheels, over to his bedside, put the brakes on, and told him to press the call buzzer when he was ready. I carried on the rest of the ward doing the observations and chatting with the patients. Quite a bit of time had passed, maybe about a half hour or more, when I realized the patient had never called back in. I went back to the side room and popped my head around the door. The man was slumped forward, clearly dead. I knew that he was not for resuscitation because of his extensive history and general health, so I entered the room and thought, poor guy, to have died on the toilet. I'll just straighten him up real quick. I went around behind to check his pulse and intended to sit him up a bit more, so he didn't fall onto the floor, before calling Jane to help me get him back on the bed. I checked his carotid pulse, and sure enough, there was nothing. I then, from behind him, put both arms under his armpits. It was at this point that it all turned really scary. As my lower arms made contact with him, and my head was quite close to his, he literally arched forward from the chest in a great big spasm that nearly sent him off the commode, and let out the loudest roar I've ever heard. I'm not exaggerating when I say it was like a roar. It was not the letting out of air you can sometimes hear when you roll a dead patient onto their side. It was a proper, deep, loud roar that went alongside a total body spasm. I was terrified. The adrenaline kicked in. I pulled my arms out and ran around the bed and straight out the door of the side room. I then ran down the main corridor, past the men's side ward, out of the unit, and into the main corridor of the hospital. I stopped myself. What exactly was I doing? I was a qualified staff nurse, and had just left a patient on their own in a dangerous situation. Furthermore, I had left the only other member of staff alone. This was shocking. I would be sacked and probably struck off, to be honest. I pulled myself together, turned around, and walked quickly but shakily back onto the unit. I found Jane, the staff nurse, outside cubicle 1 with the door closed, looking shocked and scared as that intermittent roaring continued from the inside. I explained what had happened, missing out on the bit of me running away. Thankfully, that had not been noticed. We both agreed we had to enter the room and see what was happening. We opened the door together and the patient was on the floor. He was sort of intermittently slithering and wiggling across the floor. It was awful to look at. He had his pajama bottoms still down, and his body would sort of curl up, then jackknife forward with his chest out. Each time he did this, he slid across the floor a bit. Jane and I closed the door and we went and called the doctor on duty. Shortly after, he turned up. He opened the door to this same scenario and looked clearly terrified. He said he was going to drop some painkillers that would hopefully calm the patient down a bit as well. I said that when last I checked, he didn't have a pulse, so I was not too optimistic on that front. Anyway, the three of us, the junior doctor, Jane, and myself, entered the room again. As we leaned down to take hold of the patient, all of the movement and noise stopped. We lifted him onto the bed on his back. The doctor took the syringe of medication he had prepared, but first checked his pulse. There was none. We waited for a couple of minutes, and the doctor listened with his stethoscope. Still nothing. The patient was pronounced dead. The patient did not move or make another sound again either. We were all fairly shaken up. The doctor called the manager, who decided that hot tea was in order after we had reassured the other patients. One man had said he was so scared he had hid under his blanket and cried. This guy was a tough war veteran, by the way. After as much reassurance as was possible with the circumstances, we returned for tea with the manager. The manager had already rung up another ward in the hospital and got 2 nurses to come down and watch the body of the now quiet dead man in the side room. By the time we had finished tea and biscuits, the porters were taking the body off the ward down to the hospital morgue, and myself and Jane felt immensely relieved. I was very impressed with that manager. He understood that we were all shaken up and did not downplay our feelings or fear. The night manager explained that in all his years at the hospital, he had encountered one similar scenario. Jane and I did not ask for details. Anyway, I think that's the most scared I've ever been. A few years later, I told a friend of mine about it. She asked a neurologist for a medical explanation. He said something about involuntary spasms after death or something like that. I've always had an active imagination, and at the time I genuinely really believed that when this man died the first time, something came back and possessed his body and really wanted to stay. When I was about 8 years old, I went to one of those traveling carnivals/fairs. They usually have a pirate ship ride that swings back and forth, but that year there was a new one that went upside down. Even though I was too short, I just had to get on it. My plan had been to subtly stand on my toes when the operator checked my height, but he waved me on without even checking in the first place. I stood in line about 10 minutes before getting on, so I knew what to expect. It would swing back and forth about 5 times, each time going higher and higher, before coming to rest upside down, and eventually going all the way around 3 or 4 times and coming to a stop. Well, I took my seat and pulled my harness down over my shoulders. The ride started. Back, forward, click. As we began our 3rd swing, my harness suddenly popped up. I tried to pull it back down, but it wouldn't lock into place no matter what I did. As we swung backwards, I started sliding forward in my seat. Immediately, I started screaming. Maybe the operator couldn't hear me over everyone else. Maybe he was used to people getting scared and screaming similar things. Both possibilities went through my head. I looked over to the lady next to me and started yelling to her, "I'm falling out!" It was one of those situations where time slows down. I remember looking over to her and seeing her laughing, because she at first thought I was just afraid. I remember though seeing the immediate change in her face when she noticed my harness was up and that I was lifting into the air. She extended her arm over and tried to hold me down into the seat as the ride swung forward again. She started screaming too. By this point, we were maybe 1 swing, maybe 2 away from going upside down. I was trying to push my feet into the seat in front of me to stay back against mine. All the while, I was still pulling the harness down and hoping it would click back into place. At this point, the lady's screams had gotten the attention of the people in front of and behind us. Now everyone was screaming. I knew that we were about to go upside down. We were high enough on our forward swing that we were practically looking up into the sky. As we swung back that last time, I expected to fall out. Just as we started swinging back, though, the ride jolted to a stop. We slowly lowered to the ground, and I jumped out of my seat and ran to my mother. I was so afraid it didn't even occur to me to thank the lady who'd gotten everyone else's attention. Wherever she is, whoever she is, thank you. My most frightening moment, or one among my top 5, was while I was living in Oman in 2016. Even though it's a traditional Islamic country, it is quite modern. Almost 45% of Oman's population are expatriates, so Omanis are generally quite tolerant and friendly toward Western foreigners. I took care to dress conservatively and keep my religious views or lack thereof to myself though, so for the most part I felt really safe. Be this as it may, I was still a pale, long-haired European female, so I did get quite a few looks from both men and women. These looks usually showed simple curiosity, but sometimes they were inappropriate and made me feel really uncomfortable. Since it was rare and not too intrusive though, I usually ignored such encounters. However, there was one event that freaked the life out of me. One evening, I went to the mall alone after my kids fell asleep to do my grocery shopping. I find that Omanis, just as some other Arab nations, are quite nocturnal, meaning it's not strange to find families alongside small children out in the malls till very late at night. I parked in the underground mall garage and went on with my shopping. At one point, a group of men in distachas, white robes, and kuma, traditional caps, passed by me. They looked at me, laughing amongst themselves. One of the men leaned as I passed and said something to me in Arabic. I walked faster, went to the grocery store for my groceries, and soon forgot about those men altogether. But they hadn't forgotten about me. When I was finished, I took my bags to my car. As I was returning the shopping cart to the cart corral, a car slowly passed me by. I would not pay a lot of attention to a passing car, but something felt wrong. When I looked up, I saw those same 5 young men from the creepy mall encounter in this car. They were looking straight at me, with the windows rolled down and smiling eerily. For a moment, I thought they might be looking at someone else. I turned around but found I was alone, and that they were indeed looking at me. They smiled and said stuff in Arabic to each other and to me. I walked faster towards my car, feeling very uneasy. As I continued walking, I realized that the garage had gotten quite empty. The mall was closing, and most people had already gone. I got into my car, locked the door, and looked around to see if their car was anywhere near. I couldn't see it, so I breathed a huge sigh of relief, happy they were gone. Just at that moment, though, they drove into a parking space right next to mine and stopped. Their windows were still rolled down, and they were gesticulating to me to roll mine down too. I did just enough to hear them, hoping I could answer whatever question they had, and they would leave me alone as soon as possible. However, as I rolled it down, what I heard was an invitation to get into their car and go with them. The guy sitting beside the driver was talking to me. The others were laughing and cheering him on. It was as if they were puberty-stricken teenagers rooting for their pal as he was trying to kiss a girl he liked. The major difference was that there was nothing pure in the way they were behaving. What scared me the most, though, was that in their eyes I saw a combination of hatred and want that I'd never seen before. I guess for them I was a representation of that Western woman they'd heard about, a sexually wild, promiscuous, and free woman, a seductive and forbidden opposite of all their women were. I rolled up the window and pretended to type on my phone, hoping they would go if I ignored them. They did after a while. I was a bit shaken, but decided it was just a weird encounter, and started driving toward the exit of the garage. There was one way up and out from where I was, and as I was approaching it, I realized their car was stood in the middle of the way, blocking all passage. I drove slowly and then stopped, keeping a bit of distance between my car and theirs. There was no way I could pass them to go outside. The only other option was staying in the garage. I couldn't go into the mall from the garage on foot, because they had locked the door for closing. I had no idea what to do. I tried calling my husband, but he had fallen asleep with the kids and was not answering. I hoped this was some sick game of theirs, and they would leave me and let me go after they'd had their fun. Instead of this, their car doors opened all at once, and they started getting out. This exact moment was one of the most frightening I've ever experienced. I had no idea what to do. I instinctively grabbed my mobile and started gesticulating, pretending I was talking to someone. I was showing it their license plate and pretended to dictate the number to someone else. I was so scared I couldn't even look at their faces. I was making this pretend show, but inside I felt like curling underneath my seat and closing my ears and eyes. For whatever reason, though, this tactic worked. It obviously scared them, because one of them slammed on my car with an open palm aggressively, then they all hopped back in the car and took off. I came home, crawled into bed between my husband and pillows, and laid there shivering. They didn't even touch me, but I still felt deeply violated and harassed.